Hi everybody, it's Grandad here again. I'm going to tell you a little story today which involves one of my models, one of my model ships, and it's this one. Now I'll bring it in now so you can have a little look at it. Now this ship was involved in quite a interesting story, and the ship was known as the H.M.S. Bounty. And of course the story I'm going to tell is about the mutiny on the Bounty. Now this ship started life, and I've got some information here about it, if I can bring it up. As usual, everything goes wrong. It was actually His Majesty's armed vessel, so it's HMAV Bounty, or H.M.S. Bounty, and it was built in 1784 at the Paisley shipyard in Hull, Yorkshire, and it was a coal ship called the Betha, or the Betha. It was renamed after it was purchased by the Royal Navy. It cost them £1,950 in May 1789. And it was a three-mast ship. It was 101 feet long, and it was 25 feet wide, I believe. And it weighed 230 tons, so it was quite a big ship. And it had lots of guns on it, and not a lot of guns, but it had 4 main guns here, and it had 10 small deck guns which are on the side, and I'll show you those in more detail in a minute. But the idea of this ship was reconfigured. The main cabin where the captain would normally live or stay while he was on board was converted into a large greenhouse. Because the idea, it had many windows put in and a glass roof or skylights to let as much light in, and it had a lead floor so that the floor of the cabin could not lose its water, because when they watered these breadfruits which they were going to collect from Tahiti, and that was the aim of the mission, was to go to Tahiti and to gather breadfruit. Now I've got a picture of a breadfruit here. Now I don't know a great deal about breadfruit, but that's a picture of a breadfruit. Strange looking thing, and apparently it was very nutritious, and the idea was they were going to take it to the West Indies and they were going to try and grow these breadfruit in the hope that they could feed the slaves on them and have a cheaper way of feeding slaves in those colonies where they were housed. So that was a purpose behind it. Now I've got a picture here also of Captain Bligh. I couldn't find many pictures of the crew, Fletcher, who was a famous mutineer on board the Bounty, but that's a picture of Captain Bligh, so that's probably what he looked like. Now this voyage was in big trouble before it ever left, really. The ship, being the way it was configured, with the captain losing his cabin, meant that he had to take up some quarters elsewhere on the ship, and this made it very cramped, and it was very poor for the crew, who had to share cabins and whatnot, and it meant that right from the outset there was this ship was not very comfortable to sail on. It was very cramped, the conditions, and they had a terrible journey out there. They went round Cape Horn, I believe, and they ran into terrible weather, and they were driven back at one stage, and so the trip to Tahiti was fraught with terrible sort of conditions. So most people on board the ship, it wasn't a happy ship. There was certainly... Now Captain Bligh has been sort of blamed for the fact that the people on board mutinied. Now I don't know whether Captain Bligh was wholly to blame. I mean, certainly he was a very strict captain, but in actual fact he wasn't a captain. He was a lieutenant. But because this was such a small ship, it didn't really need to have a captain on board. You know, I mean, he was considered to be the captain, but he wasn't really a proper captain in the sense of being a captain of a ship as they would normally be. But anyway, he was in charge, and Fletcher Christian was his next in command. Now, he'd known Fletcher Christian for a long time. He'd been on voyages with Fletcher Christian, so he wasn't a stranger to him. And to start off with anyway, they seemed to have been quite friendly. But things seemed to go wrong on board this ship. And they were a young crew. I mean, I'm just reading here the appointment of the ship's cook, and he was only 21, at the age of 21. So the cook on board was only 21. The actual age of the rest of the people on board the ship was quite young, and so I can understand how living in cramped conditions and having to save on various materials and things on board, and with Captain Bligh being a bit of a feisty sort of a person, he wasn't able to control his men very good, and they sort of fell out. And eventually they got to Tahiti, and they landed, but I don't know whether it was the wrong time of the year or what, but certainly they had to stay over in Tahiti for much longer than what you'd perhaps see what they were going to. They had to wait while these breadfruits became dormant or something, so they were on the island for a long time. And because young men, as they would be, they got fraternising with the local natives on Tahiti, and a lot of them took up quite friendly relations, shall we say, with the natives on board, which made some of them a bit ill. You can imagine the diseases that they were prone to, and so things weren't happy. When they come to leave with their breadfruit, and they loaded over 100 or so breadfruit on board this ship, and to take it to the West Indies, and they set off from Tahiti with a disgruntled crew. And because these breadfruit needed a lot of water was very scarce, and I think Captain Bligh apparently restricted and limited the amount of water that people could use. Although I don't think on ships they actually drank a lot of water. They were allowed a mug of grog a day, a rum a day, a rem ration. So I don't know as they needed a great deal of water, but certainly it was rationed. And therefore they had to make sure that the breadfruit survived. So they made sure that the breadfruit had enough water, but the crew members probably didn't. And this caused friction and all sorts of problems. Now, when the film was made about the Bounty, it was firmly blamed on Captain Bligh for his harshness and ill treatment of the crew, and floggings and all sorts of things like that. Now, these things did take place, but then you had to maintain discipline on ship. And if people were not behaving and doing what they were supposed to do, then I suppose the captain was quite in his rights to use his authority to maintain order on board ship. Now, most of these ships, when they sailed with a proper captain in a big ship, they would have military people on board, which were there mainly to protect the captain from the crew. I mean, the idea of a lot of men with they'd have cutlasses and knives, and I believe there was muskets on board as well that were locked away. But there was a lot of people on this ship. There weren't normally they would have soldiers which would guard and keep the crew in order, but they didn't have it on this ship. And I can imagine, after being on this ship for a long time and getting very disgruntled and missing the native girls that they'd met on the Tahiti Islands, they were pretty well disgruntled and not very happy. So when they left Tahiti on this ship, now I'll bring you in a little bit closer. I don't want to make this film too wobbly, but I'll try and bring you in a little bit closer so you can get a better look at the H.M.S. Bounty. I'm sorry if it's wriggling around a bit, but I'm trying to give you the best view you can of this ship. Maybe if I move it over here so you've got a white background, you'll be able to see it even better. Now, this model I've made of the ship, it's in full sail. Well, there's a couple of sails still furled, but if I move you down, bring you in a little bit closer, you can see that along the rails there are, it's not focusing terribly well, there are guns along the edge there, mounted on deck, and then down below there's cannons poking out through the side. And now, as you notice, I haven't painted this ship. I wasn't very good at painting. but it shows you, I mean, it would have been a wooden ship, so it would have been brown, but I'm not very good at painting. But I did manage on this ship to make the rigging, which is very difficult, and therefore you've got the sails there and the rigging of the ship, and that shows you what the Bounty was like. Now when they cast adrift, the men on the Bounty, if I bring this back over here again now into the background and turn you round again to this way, when they were on board the ship, they fell out, and they decided that Captain Bligh and the loyal members of the crew should be set adrift on the high seas. And I've got a picture here, if I can bring it up quickly. Captain Bligh, and there's the men being cast adrift. He cast them adrift in an open boat, and there was 18 on there, but there wasn't room for all the people on that who wanted to stay loyal to the captain, so they kept them on board, and they actually returned to Tahiti, where they left some of the mutineers, decided to stay on Tahiti, and other ones decided that they would go and stay on Tahiti because they didn't want to be involved with the mutiny. But the rest set sail again on the Bounty, and they landed on a place called Pitcairn Island. Now apparently this Pitcairn Island is a very difficult place to find, and according to what they say, that the maps weren't very good, so finding Pitcairn Island was quite difficult by map. So they went there and they stayed on Pitcairn Island for a long time, but because they took women from Tahiti with them, they thought they'd have an easy life on a desert island, and they took a few Polynesians with them as well. But this didn't really work out very good, and they soon fell out with one another, and apparently on Pitcairn Island, because of the falling out, they actually ended up sort of killing each other. I mean, it probably wasn't a very good place to live. Living on a desert island is not the ideal place to decide to go and live. So living on Pitcairn wasn't very clever. And Christian died after about 12 months, I think. I don't know whether he got ill or whatever. So he would die. But they sent the Bounty, the people who were on the Bounty, they managed to travel thousands of miles across the sea. I mean, they had one or two mishaps where they tried to land on islands and the natives weren't friendly, and they managed to escape from them. But they sailed across the sea, and they managed eventually, Captain Bligh and these men managed to find safety and get back to civilization. And they sent another vessel. I don't know whether Captain Bligh was actually on it, but they certainly sent another vessel out to try and capture these mutineers and bring them to justice. And when they got back to Tahiti, the ones that were on Tahiti, they managed to capture them, and I think several of them were court-martialed and they were hung, and some were brought back to England and tried, and it caused a great deal of trouble. Now, they never actually found Christian and the people on Pitcairn. They lived there, but as I say, they got their punishment really because they didn't survive very well on Pitcairn Island. And the mutiny on the Bounty is a famous thing, and there's films been made about it. As I say, not entirely perhaps the truth about what happened. In those days things were very much harder and harsher, and people, the conditions on this ship were probably pretty poor, and so it's not surprising that the ship itself was very ill-fated, and people were not very happy to be on board the Bounty. So that's probably what added to the problems and meant that this ship didn't really survive very well. Now, I think the ship itself was sunk eventually. I mean, and if you go on the internet, you can find out all about the Bounty and its crew. I've got a lot more information there, but I didn't want to make this video too long and too boring, going through statistics and just reading it off the phone, when you could actually look it up for yourself. So if you're interested in the mutiny on the Bounty, go on the internet and you find all the stories relating to it and the films, and people have researched it. But I like my Bounty ship. It took a long time to make, and I enjoy making ships, and I've got some more ships which I'll show you. But this really is only a short video today, so I think I'll wrap it up now and say goodbye. But look up the Bounty, find out all about it, because it's a very interesting story. And until I see you again, This is Grandad as usual, signing off and saying goodbye for now. Bye bye.